Iran still is taking a very hard stance on its positions in this ongoing war during the ceasefire. It has said that it's not going to discuss the nuclear file anymore with the United States in any talks, should they come about, because right now there are no talks happening. But they're also still continuing to enforce their control over the Strait of Hormuz, which they say is going to be permanent, alongside Oman. They seized a ship yesterday, as well as sinking another one as of the last 24 hours. And so, Greg, what I wanted to ask you is, what's your impressions of what's happening right now? We're hearing reports that Israel is clamoring about immediate strikes on Iran once Trump touches down and I guess gets settled. But what's your take on what's happening here and where all of this fits in the developments of the last 24 or 48 hours, or however long you're following it?
Well, I've been looking less at the military aspect because it's pretty much at a stalemate. You know, there's some tit for tat going on. Of course, Israel's always going to be clamoring for more strikes. First of all, you know, they didn't want to do it while he was over during the trade delegation. And, you know, next week's Memorial Day weekend, that's not going to be very popular among the U.S. citizenry. But yeah, so what I've been looking at more has been this weird budget play within the Pentagon, you know, getting in front of the Senate this week to discuss, you know, how much the Iran war has cost. They say $25 billion. Sure. No actual respectable analyst thinks that this has only cost $25 billion. And the brass that went in front of the Senate this week, they also claimed that they hadn't factored in the damage done to the bases across the Gulf. And now we're getting reports that, you know, they're having to cancel mass training exercises against all continental U.S. Forces stationed in the U.S. In order to save money and costs, but they have an unprecedented budget. But the war is not costing that much. But now they need $1.5 trillion for the coming fiscal year. It's just really not making sense. And of course, the Pentagon has never really passed an audit. But none of this really bodes well. And so, yeah, Israel may be clambering for another attack. The U.S. Navy still has to keep a standoff distance, because now that there's been a couple weeks of breathing room, people have been able to take a step back and look at the new democratization of warfare that has occurred over this conflict. And of course, you know, we saw that in 2025 when during Operation True Promise 3.0, when the Iranians were able to break through Israeli, U.S., and Jordanian ADA systems and put rounds on target like at Natanz Air Force Base. But now we're seeing another critical vulnerability. And so over the past couple of weeks, I've been focusing more on the domestic side, what this means militarily for the United States. And when I mention that, I'm talking specifically about the AWS, the Amazon Web Services cloud data centers, which have a dual function of civilian use and military functionality, get hit in Qatar enough that Larry Fink went in front of the Melkin Institute Summit and said, hey, this is a real drone warfare from lone actors is a significant domestic terrorist threat, enough where a $3,000 drone could put out of commission a $5 billion data center. And so when we can't just talk about ships and drones and munitions anymore, because this AI cloudware architecture is basically the new platform for how the Pentagon is trying to wage military operations across the globe. And they're not just centered in the United States. They're in the Gulf, they're in Europe and stuff. And like, because it's cloud-based, all of these things are integrated together. And so if you lose one, it kind of affects a lot of others as well. So there's this massive vulnerability, not just within like conventional third generation warfare, aircraft carriers, large naval command ships, but also this tech infrastructure that is completely unsecurable. It's so unsecurable that here in the congressional district where I'm running, which has Fort Hood, third largest military base in the continental United States, is building a civilian-run commercial data center. Of course, there's no such thing as a commercial data center anymore. All of them are dual use and have military functions because all these tech companies have defense contracts. Even if they're not doing a lot in defense, you know, they get subsidies and like R&D tax breaks and stuff like that. But they're building these data centers on 4 different military installations now. across the country, two in Texas and I think one in North Carolina around Fort Bragg and stuff, because these data centers are unsecurable. And even though they're civilian run and have commercial functions, they are absolutely vulnerable to, as Larry Fink was talking about, a $3,000 DJI drone, which can drop a munition in a critical place and shut the entire thing down for however long. So, yes, of course, Israel may attack again. Our ships are still not going to be able to engage the Iranian coastline safely. And we have a whole new vulnerability that we didn't even know we had before. And that's the AI warfighting architecture, as Pete Hegseth would call it. So no, there's not only have the talks gone nowhere and the off-ramp for the Trump administration to gracefully exit this conflict is gone. No, we've seen an escalation of more critical vulnerabilities than we ever knew before. And of course, theoretically, we always knew that they existed, but the extent to which they really undermine profits and investments in certain sectors it's just a completely full spectrum problem from a military and economic standpoint. So yeah, nothing improved. The trade mission, which looked more like an 1800s trade mission where the monarch and a bunch of capitalists and oligarchs go to plunder wealth from the Orient, it's completely reversed in this case. Right. Nothing is going well for the Trump administration at this point, including the Iran war, and I'm sure you'll get into the China stuff later.
Yeah. Well, I think everything you just said, Greg, also demonstrates because Pete Hegseth, he's been this big champion of AI-powered military hardware and might, and a big vulnerability of that is that it's got to come from somewhere. This AI-powered tech has to come from somewhere. It's not, the cloud is still based somewhere.
No, and I think that's one of the most distracting things when people talk about it. It's this nebulous cloud. It just exists in the ether or some sort of fantasy pocket dimension. No, it requires physical hardware to run it. And that's kind of why a lot of people, especially where I'm living in rural areas, they fundamentally on a material level do not understand why we're actually losing this and why the United States is so vulnerable. It's, as someone who's trying to do community work, it's actually really frustrating. But I think we also need to do more education about just very simple stuff. Hey, the cloud is not vapor, it's solids in the form of data centers and other infrastructure as well.
Right. And if it's located in the Gulf, an Iranian drone or missile can definitely hit it. Elina, I wanted to, before I get your reaction, just show you the current state of Donald Trump and his administration when they're questioned, because there's a lot of questions about the war and, of course, the larger global situation that it fits in. But here he is on the Air Force One when he was asked about it.
What's next? Is the threat of the bombing starting again? How realistic is that?
I don't want to say that. I mean, I'd like to tell you. I'd like to say on a certain hour, a certain day, the bombing is going to start. I don't want to say that. I can only say that Iran, I can say this with very, very strong conviction, Iran will never have a nuclear weapon. Not going to happen. There's no chance. What would the use be of repeating the bombing? You did it for 38 days. Well, no, we did, and you did not get the political changes in Iran. No, I had a total military victory. But the fake news, guys like you write incorrectly. You're a fake guy, and guys like you write about it incorrectly. We had a total military victory. We knocked out their entire Navy. We knocked out their entire Air Force.
So you get the picture, Elina. This is the the narrative right now. But what are you looking at? What's your assessment of the overall situation and the global implications?
All right. So this is the situation the way I see it. Recently, there was a CIA report that was published, and obviously we've got insider information, and it was published through, Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and they had actually concluded to the fact that apparently, according to the CIA report, Iran won't actually even be affected by the blockade. Not for at least another 3 to 4 months. And this was considered to be a conservative estimate. More so, the same report actually found that even with regards to the bombings, because if we're going to talk about the bombings that Israel stating that they want to start directly hitting Iran again. And then we obviously have Trump playing around with the concept of obviously, restarting the war in Iran. even with months worth of military sort of activity against Iran and direct hits against Iran, it was found around 90% of its Iran's military capacity, 75% of its military, missiles rather, vital ballistic missiles as well, is still intact. 90% of its capacity and underground storages are all basically been completely either rebuilt or fully functional again. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at the fact that after an extensive amount of operations against Iran, the amount of damage to Iran militarily has actually been rather weak. So the other angles behind this is the economic aspect. And obviously, again, according to that CIA report, you would need another 3 to 4 months on, and again, this is a minimum, to actually see any implications for the imperialist war in Iran, whether it's through the blockade or through direct military action. So at most, what we could expect from the United States is to try to start targeting Iran again, just primarily in order to inflict, again, as much damage and harm to Iran as possible while sustaining the blockade for as long as it can. But this is the problem. And I think even The Atlantic, and I'd referenced it in some of my other work, but even The Atlantic published an article, and this is quite big when you think it's coming from mainstream media outlets, and they're discussing, and the title of the article was Iran has checkmated, Iran checkmate for the United States. And this is really interesting because when you break down this article, it becomes very clear that the United States has effectively lost this war militarily and politically, but more so geostrategically, because the basic premise of what the United States is trying to accomplish at present is to try to coerce Iran through, economic strain, through the blockade, through possibly targeting them again, to capitulate to America's demands. However, the reality is, because Iran is able to sustain the blockade, and this is in large part, in response to the fact that Iran has created an economy that is able to, become very self-sufficient as a consequence of 47 years of, sanctions, becoming rather food independent and having obviously its own energy resources, its own fertilizers. It's far better, equipped to withstand a blockade because it's been living under an economic siege for decades. Not to mention, in the small little parenthesis, that Iran has currently around 70 million barrels of oil, which is currently floating around the seas, which therefore meaning it's still continuing to sell oil, right? And at higher prices. It's also being able to continue to sell oil through Central Asia, through mainland routes, which is obviously working towards their favor. But we are seeing countries that are still basically paying, like Japan, China, and India are paying Iran, the toll to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, which is also giving Iran the ability to buffer some of the economic hardships that the United States is trying to impose on Iran. But this is the thing: to what extent will the United States be able to sustain that? The answer is not very long, because the reality is that it's actually the U.S. allies, whether it's the GCC states or its allies in Southeast Asia, East Asia more broadly, the European Union, and itself that are far more economically vulnerable to the closing down of the Strait of Hormuz. And this creates a problem for the United States and how long it's able to actually continue this operation, which again, according to the CIA, requires at least 4 months to be able to succeed any capitulation from Iran. And that won't happen. So what we're looking at effectively is that Iran has been successful, and this is what, going back to the article as well that was published by The Atlantic, to completely change the geostrategic reality of the region. And it's done so by essentially asserting control over the Strait of Hormuz, stating that from now on, yes, Iran will have complete control, tolls will be paid, and when their demands are, we want sanctions lifted and also all military activity within the region, U.S. military activity within the region to essentially withdraw. This is something that the United States can no longer change. And had the United States not actually gone to war with Iran, had not pulled off this gamble, this wouldn't have actually occurred. So to quote what that article had actually said, and I would agree to this, the United States has effectively lost a very significant control within its own geostrategic ability to power project. It's lost essentially, the Strait of Hormuz, the control over a very important trade route, and with all that, it's also significantly weakened its own allies. And I think this is another aspect behind this, because when you're looking at the GCC states, for example, there was an interesting report that was published by the Council of Foreign Relations recently, and it was talking specifically about how the war in Iran has weakened the GCC states economically. It's seeing obviously its civilian infrastructure and energy infrastructure significantly damaged, in some countries more so than others. And now what they're looking at when it comes to the GCC states is probably all that wealth that they were planning to invest, for example, in the United States in order to build the data centers that Greg was referencing just now, and all that infrastructure that the United States is trying to push forward aggressively, even though it actually doesn't have the industrial capacity to do so, but is trying to do so to compete with China. All that money, all that fund, a lot of that funds, not all of them, but a substantial amount is now going to be refunded back locally into the States, which means less money into the data centers that the United States is trying to build and all the infrastructure that it needs in order to establish their goal of building an additional 1,500 data centers in the next year. And this is a problem. This is a problem for the United States because, and as the report states there, that this, from the Council of Foreign Relations, this creates a problem because we've already seen in the last year that due to a limited amount, not enough funds going into building the infrastructure and the need for the injection of external capital, especially from the GCC states, that could actually mean, and this is what the report had found, that a lot of these tech companies and that are focused on building this infrastructure in the US will now have to rely more on debt, therefore actually creating more causing investors to lose confidence, which could risk the entire tech-heavy equity market of the US, and that is a problem for the US. So we're seeing how, to conclude on this point, at most, the United States is going to try to exert a bit more pressure on Iran by bombing them some more. But even then, by their own intelligence reports, it's not going to bring about the kind of economic strangulation that the United States is hoping to impose on Iran to cause them to capitulate. So this is a lost war that at this point, the United States simply just can't, seem to pull away from, because it will be a defeat from whatever angle you look at it.
Yeah, and I believe you're referencing in the Atlantic. That article was written by Robert Kagan, maybe
real OG neocon.
Yeah, maybe the OG, maybe the Tony Soprano of neocons. He the 21st, the Project for a New American Century. That was his co-founded with Bill Kristol, their brainchild of neoconservatism. And Greg, you often talk about your history, with the war on terror, war of terror, how you kind of got into analysis. Yeah, how you got into analysis and community work and all of that because of this anti-war work. But when Elina was talking, it made me think about these remarks about the war that Trump just gave to Sean Hannity post-China trip, and they strike me as
this quote. This is breaking right now.
Yeah. Well, this happened probably within the last 12 hours.
Okay.
It reminded me of the Kissinger quote everyone talks about, where it's to be an enemy, to be a friend of the United States, or the United States, is fatal. Here is what Trump said about why the United States is at war with Iran.
We don't need it at all.
We don't need it at all.
We don't need it at all.
Fair enough. So,
I mean, you could make the case, why are we even? We're doing it to help Israel and to help Saudi Arabia and to help Qatar and UAE and, Kuwait and other countries, Bahrain.
it also helps China.
And I told them today, I said, we're helping you, and we're helping you in another way.
So anyway, it's all about, and a lot of people have argued that this war has been all about Israel, but Donald Trump is saying he's helping the entire region. This was a benevolent action on the United States to help them with Iran, but the results, as Elina just stated, are quite damning. But your thoughts on this?
Specifically, we went to war. We began this war solely for Israeli interests.
Yeah. Oh no. Well, to Trump's comments, but that's what there's a narrative that argues this, and Donald Trump here is saying, no, we were here to help Israel and all of the Gulf states, the entire region, with Iran.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could frame it that way. A lot of these Gulf states and like authoritarian monarchies are lockstep with Israel. Israel and them have same security interests, foreign policy objectives, in similar spheres of influence. And, the people might not like the Israeli government or the Zionist ideology. But then again, since the Arab Spring, all of the Israel's big insurance policy throughout the Gulf has been to export spyware and security apparatus and intelligence sharing with all of these like-minded monarchical governments. But like to say that we went to war strictly for them or for Israeli interests is absolutely kind of naive. This is kind of a reversal of the language of the global war on terror, whereas like America is the world police. So now we have to coalition build, right? We have to like bring in NATO into Iraq. We had to have soldiers from the Czech Republic and Mongolia to come here to build a global consensus for this illegal, unjust, completely immoral war that we're fighting or occupation that we're sustaining in Iraq. So we used to do like coalition building. And then, we even saw the last vestiges of this with Operation Prosperity Guardian. Prosperity Guardian. Yeah, it's where the Joint Naval Task Force between the United States and a bunch of European countries tried to reopen the Gulf of Aden after the Houthis began attacking shipping in solidarity with Gaza. And so that was an unsuccessful maritime naval operation. And they still had to do coalition building to build consensus because they were still, at least the Biden administration and their kind of like neoliberal imagination of foreign policy, still believed in that old consensus building, cultivation and protection of soft power, and presenting America as, the one who can keep the trade lanes open. So everybody has to support us. Now, it's kind of this bizarre reversal in terms of a narrative going forward that no, we're going in to help all of our allies and Israel, even though this war has been self-destructive, both for the U.S. military, for the Gulf states. It's been an absolute nightmare. Yeah. Like we're talking about Iran developing a nuclear weapon to threaten the Gulf. They don't have to. They just have to hit all their desalination facilities. All the elites will flee, and their indentured labor force will like die of dehydration or something crazy. So it's an absolutely absurd statement from like it's like multifaceted absurdity going forward, that like this war was to help anybody else except for like the transnational like capitalist class, associated a lot with American and Israeli interests, but also these sub-imperial states. But they were given, when we're talking about like a transnational class, like all of these Gulf magnates were given assurances that, we're going to protect you. You have a U.S. military base, okay? That assures our protection. Our interests are aligned. We're going to attack Iran. We gave them all these assurances, and we absolutely screwed them over. And so they're not happy. So Trump can go on to Sean Hannity and other sycophantic news outlets and be like, yeah, we're doing this to help the Gulf states. First of all, they didn't want it in the first place. There was a perfectly fine situation going on with Iran before, without a bunch of like agents of chaos moving throughout the region. But now we're stuck with an intractable situation where we've given Iran essentially a Suez Canal in some ways, and made them like a kind of fourth center of world power around this incredibly strategic location, which is, and makes it even more of a geostrategic nightmare, because of their axis of resistance attaches to the shipping through the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden too. So like if they want to expand, and if the US wants to bring bombing back into this and start another high intensity bombing campaign, bearing in mind that we gave them everything we had in the first 2 weeks, everything. Like it can't get worse or be more devastating or effective than it was during the first 2 weeks. It's not possible. Stockpiles aren't there. The target set isn't there. That's a big thing. All the thousands of targets we hit no longer exist. So what's next? Secondary importance targets, tertiary importance targets. So, and if they open this up again, as I mentioned, data centers vulnerable, desalination sites vulnerable, closing down shipping via the Houthis potentially, or other actors via the Red Sea. There's no way that resuming this conflict ends in a way that's more strategically advantageous to the United States or Israel or the Gulf states. It's an absolutely absurd thing to say in an interview, but of course he's not accountable to his base for anything he says.
Yeah. Yeah. And we also have a mess now. Iran confronted the UAE at the BRICS Foreign Ministers Summit. And the UAE seems to now be, it's not an island, although they claim they have some jurisdiction over some islands near Iran. But they are now seemingly all alone, where Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, all of these countries are now saying that they don't really want to do any more military interventionist adventures. And the UAE is the one, as the conduit of the U.S. and Israel, trying to persuade them. That's the latest reports. It's quite something. But Elina, sorry, Greg, did you want to say something?
Just want to say too, like another thing that I don't hear a lot of people talking about, the old like post World War II guarantees of a SOFA agreement, a status of forces agreement, where the U.S. would sign a contract to open up a military base in a country, and it would give them like strategic or political or diplomatic leverage over their neighbors or competitors and stuff. That era is coming to an end, and we're not just seeing I don't think we're just going to see requests in the Sahel region or demands in the Sahel region or West Asia for the shutting down of U.S. military bases, but it's going to become over the next few years more and more of a rapid thing. Because like what now is the benefit of having U.S. imperial presence in your home country? Of course, this is not going to go away overnight, but like over the next decade, I think we're going to see a massive, massive drawdown of U.S. Global force presence across the globe. That's it.